A very warm welcome to the first session in our three-part crypto bootcamp series. I'm Sue McLean and I'm a partner in Baker McKenzie's technology group in London. Through this short mini-series of pre-recorded training sessions, we'll provide you with an overview of the regulation of crypto assets in key jurisdictions. Our team have long been at the vanguard of crypto asset development and the opportunities and challenges for our clients. We will be drawing on the expertise of members from across our global financial services regulatory practice, IP, technology, tax, and others, with deep roots in all major financial centres and long-standing relationships with financial services regulators. We hope that you find our insights helpful. In this first session, we're going to provide an introduction to crypto assets. This session, which was recorded earlier this year, is a primer on the basics of crypto, including how we got to where we are, how crypto works, common use cases and types of crypto assets, key infrastructure, and related considerations. We encourage everyone to join us at our second session, where a panel of experts discuss crypto regulation in the EU, Switzerland, the UK, and the USA. And then in our third session, we conclude the series with a panel discussion on crypto regulation in APAC, covering Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, and Thailand. I was very pleased to have been joined for this session by Sam Kramer, who is a partner in our technology group in Chicago, and Roger van der Berg, who is a legal director in tax from our Amsterdam office. Okay, so let's jump into the first session of our series, Crypto Primer. Moving on to today's agenda for the session, we're going to give a quick intro background to crypto. We're going to look at some of the use cases and types of crypto assets that we have. We're going to have a really interesting deep dive into Bitcoin, so you can all try and get your heads around the most famous of all the cryptocurrencies. And then we're going to have a quick skip through stablecoins and NFTs, which I would say are the new kids on the crypto block. Introduction to crypto. So cryptocurrencies or virtual currencies are digital means of exchange that use cryptography for security. And the word crypto comes from the ancient Greek word kryptos, which means hidden or private. And if you've heard anything about cryptocurrencies, you know that in a way they really challenge the orthodoxy of how a currency works. And in ways that excites a lot of people, but also worries others. Cryptocurrencies are entirely digital. Nobody prints money or mints physical coins. Everything is done online. And if we move on, we will all have recognized that cryptocurrency, crypto assets are becoming increasingly mainstream. And I think this has certainly been demonstrated by the recent, what one would say was kind of a milestone for the sector, when very recently Coinbase, a leading crypto exchange platform, debuted on NASDAQ. Now, you might say that the crypto evangelists out there would say, well, this is selling out, right? The whole ethos around this was that we would eliminate the need for centralized gatekeepers and traditional finance. And really now we're joining the two together. But I think for me, the main takeaway is, though, that crypto businesses are now in these kind of more mature states, and now they have a seat at the traditional capital markets table. And so that's a very exciting development. But how did we get here? So if we move on and we look at the beginning of cryptocurrency, in terms of Bitcoin as the most famous crypto, a lot of you may know about the beginnings of this. So in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto published a white paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, describing this Bitcoin blockchain network. Now, famously, no one knows, or at least most people don't know who Satoshi is, or whether actually it's a group of people. But this person or these people mined the first block of Bitcoin back in 2009, and embedded in that first block the headline of the Times newspaper at the time, which was talking about the credit crash of 2008. And I think a lot of people have linked the two. What most commentators say is the financial crisis was not the reason for Bitcoin, but it was a symptom of the reason. This particular circumstance showed you that the challenges with the financial system that relies very much on banks and third-party intermediaries. when it first started, Bitcoin, it had almost no value for the first few months. I think actually in April 2010, which was about 6 months after it started, Bitcoin was less than 14 cents. And obviously what we've seen since then is a real fluctuation in the value of Bitcoin, often, being driven by, on the one hand, investor enthusiasm, and then obviously other concerns can really damage the Bitcoin price, whether that's regulatory or security or other concerns. But today, if you had bought a Bitcoin back in 2010 and kept on hold of it, from my recent checks, at least in the UK, that would equal about £39,000. So if you do have Bitcoin with you that you've been holding on to for a long time, this is a good time. But obviously what we don't know is how that will fluctuate over the next few years. But it's important, if we move on to the next slide, it's important to say that this was an evolution. A lot of the aspects of Bitcoin really were based on other developments that had happened over time. If you go back to, the as far back as the 70s and the 80s, that this kind of concept of sharing currency that didn't require a centralized entity was being explored and discussed. In the 90s, somebody created an anonymous crypto called DigiCash. BitGold was designed in 1998 by Nick Szabo, who's very famous in the smart contract world, which involved some of the attributes of Bitcoin. But the ultimate challenge was still how you avoided a double spending problem. And that really wasn't solved until Nakamoto published his paper in Bitcoin. So there's a lot of history behind crypto and Bitcoin, but it kind of all came to a head in the late 2000s, and that's really where we start our story. So now we've just had that sort of quick step through the history of crypto. Roger is going to provide an introduction to the use cases we see for crypto and the types of crypto assets we have now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One of the first use cases of Bitcoin, or actually the first use case of Bitcoin, was to use it to buy 2 pizzas. And that happened in 20 May 2010. We call that Bitcoin Pizza Day, where an American computer engineer bought 2 Bitcoins from a local pizza joint for around 10,000 Bitcoins, which is, as we speak, around $560 million in current Bitcoin value. But that basically started out as the first time that someone bought something for Bitcoins. And then when Bitcoin actually got value through this first transaction, then people started to buy other things with it as well. And before Sam goes a bit further into the technicalities of Bitcoin, it is very good to know that Bitcoin allows everyone to pay or to send Bitcoins to each other around the world, and that these sending of those Bitcoins are permissionless. Anyone can do it, and you don't need anyone's permission. And that was in the beginning a very nice idea, but you can of course understand that there were also big concerns about worldwide permissionless payments, because where are the payments ending up? Well, and this is actually where the media got in. And in the next slide, you will see a few headlines from a few years ago, which are striking in that respect. This headline talks about terrorists turn to Bitcoin for funding and they're learning fast. The next headline is that the UK company was linked to laundering Bitcoin billions. And the third headline talks about men that are busted over a Bitcoin-based drug ring where they were selling cocaine and weed for Bitcoins. So if we then go to the next slide, this is quite a narrative that the media set down, but it's not entirely true at this point in time. Because if we take a look at this survey on risk assessments on money laundering by the Bank of England, you see that actually banks, accountancy firms, and legal service providers, as well as money service business, are still on top of money laundering. And digital currencies are at the very bottom, which is also backed by numbers by the UN, because at this point in time, around 0.34% of all Bitcoin transactions are brought into context with money laundering or other activities, while almost 3% of all transactions in normal currencies are brought in that respect, and over 10% of global GDP is stashed away in tax havens, etc. So what is it basically? What scares the media here? And I think if we go back a bit in time, you see that exactly the same happened with the internet, because before, worldwide permissionless payments were a big issue for governments and the media. The same happened with worldwide permissionless sharing of information, and that happened in the internet. And as you can see here, I gathered some newspaper clippings from the mid to the late 90s, and there you can also see the analogy that is being set now with the internet and with cryptocurrencies. For example, the internet will fail. The local mall does more business in an afternoon than the entire internet handles in a month. Well, I think that is not the case anymore. And of course, putting search engines in the same analogy as terrorist fringe, etc., is something that we can now not imagine anymore. And yeah, I believe that this analysis is quite striking. If we then take a look, what are nowadays then cryptocurrencies being used for? In the next slide, there are some examples, and I think indeed at this point in time, the majority of the cryptocurrencies are indeed used for saving and investing. But there is a trend that also cryptocurrencies are more and more used to be hedging against inflation. And what you see is nowadays the central bank in America, of course, the European Central Bank, they are printing a lot of money, and more private persons, but also major companies. For example, the biggest example is MicroStrategy and Tesla. Big American public companies are buying Bitcoin on their balance in order to hedge against this inflation. Well, of course, further than that, you have the traders, you have the commodity buyers, of course, you have people who would like to claim certain ownership with crypto, and of course, the Internet of Things, which we will address a bit later. But also, and I think finally something to mention is that you can also use crypto for crowdfunding of businesses, whether it is via a so-called ICO, so a crypto IPO, or whether it is really just for funding worldwide your company, is a very interesting concept, and you see it more and more happening. So if you take a look at these different use cases, you basically see that it's rather weird that you could do it with one sort of token, and that is also the case. So if we go to the next slide, you basically can see that you have three types of crypto coins. The first one is the one that we probably all know, that is the payment token. So that are coins that are being used for paying goods and services, like the pizzas that were bought with Bitcoin back in 2010. Also, another kind of token is a security token, and security tokens are basically equity tokens that allow you to have a piece of a business or a piece of an other kind of investment that you would also have in the regular, more analog world, and that token represents then the ownership of that investment by you. Thirdly, we have utility tokens, and those tokens are basically tokens that grant holders access to and use of any digital resources. So for example, with those tokens, you can actually pay for a service like a network or an application, or they are used in video games to basically improve the car that you are driving in the game, or your shields and weapons for your soldiers in any games. A big characteristics of this utility token is that these tokens are generally used So where payment tokens and security tokens are not really used, they don't disappear after you transfer them, utility tokens have that nature. So that is something to keep into account. Of course, you also have hybrids. So for example, Ethereum, another kind of Bitcoin, so to say, another kind of cryptocurrency, has a little bit of all three. For example, you can use Ethereum on the internet to buy, for example, a hardware wallet with. On the other hand, the Ethereum gas fee is basically a fee that really gets burned by using smart contracts. So in that respect, you also have some hybrid tokens. And while this sounds very technical, I think we are now going to Sam's explanation of how Bitcoin works. And I think if we keep this a bit in the back of our heads, then I think after Sam's explanation, it will all make a lot more sense. So Sam, I give the floor to you.
Roger, thank you very much for that interesting discussion of use cases. It's now my turn to attempt to explain how Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain and Bitcoins work. If we can, let's move to the next slide. And as Sue had mentioned, the origins of Bitcoin and Nakamoto's white paper basically coincided in time with the global financial crisis and a general loss of trust in financial institutions. And one of the stated objectives in Nakamoto's white paper was to create a cashless system without intermediaries to exchange value. And it turns out that blockchain technology with its encryption protection is an ideal transaction rail to securely store transaction records for a single source of truth, taking the place of an account ledger that might be maintained by the banks. As Sue had also said, it's important to remember Bitcoins do not exist apart from the blockchain. There's no physical token like a dollar bill or a printed euro. Bitcoins are created by a process called mining, which we'll talk about in a little bit, on the blockchain, and they can only be transferred from one account on the blockchain to another account. Mining, which we'll talk about, is the only way that new Bitcoins can be made. It's how the money supply is created in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And Bitcoins exist entirely outside of fiat and other currencies that have been adopted as legal tender by any sovereign government. So they're intended as an alternative and are not considered by most regulation to be money. And if we can go to the next slide. Yes, so if you want to create an alternative to a central banking system, what characteristics would that alternative need to have? Well, obviously you would want it to be secure. You'd want it to be decentralized and not rely on trusted third parties. So the Bitcoin blockchain uses strong encryption as a security method to do several things. One, obscure the credentials of users, to secure the transaction record, such as the transfer of Bitcoins from Alice to Bob, and to permanently secure the batch of transactions to the blockchain. All of that is done using strong encryption so that if there's any attempt to alter any of these records, they will be what we call tamper evident, not tamper proof, but everyone will see that an unauthorized alteration has been made. Now, again, Bitcoin doesn't require any centralized host of the transaction ledger the way a bank does. Rather, every participant, which in Bitcoin lingo is called a node, everyone has an identical copy of the blockchain ledger, and that ledger automatically updates every time a block is appended to the blockchain. Bitcoin doesn't require any trusted third party to validate transactions that are added to the blockchain. As we'll discuss in greater detail, Bitcoin uses something called distributed consensus to agree on the validity of transactions proposed for a permanent addition to the blockchain. So here on this slide, we've got an idealized data structure of a Bitcoin transaction. What do you do if you want to participate with Bitcoin? You download the Bitcoin software and create something called a wallet, which is essentially an account, and think of it as a mailbox. To create a transaction on the blockchain, like in our picture here, where Alice wants to transfer a certain number of Bitcoins to Bob, you need a private code to initiate the transaction. You need a public key, or the mailbox, which is the recipient's destination. And then the software creates something called a hash pointer. And that's a cryptographically secure pointer to the origin of those Bitcoins that are being transferred. So we have to see if Alice wants to transfer 5 Bitcoin to Bob, then this hash pointer will show the 5 prior Bitcoin that Alice has received that she is now transferring to Bob. And it's important to note that these hash pointers can't be altered or erased. And some people have called the Bitcoin transfer record as infinitely traceable, which is why, in my opinion, it's actually particularly lousy for use by criminals, and cash is much preferred because cash is much less traceable. So if you go to the next slide. And here we see that when I want to make a transfer happen, when Alice wants to transfer Bitcoins to Bob, she doesn't call her banker to initiate a wire transfer. Rather, she uses that software to initiate a transaction, the one we saw on the prior slide, and broadcast it to every computer of every other Bitcoin user. When the Bitcoin software is running on a computer, the node, that is everyone else using Bitcoin, listens for transactions. If they look valid on their face, which means if the sender has a sufficient balance of previously received Bitcoin, Alice has in her account at least 5 Bitcoin that she's received before, then the node will consider that valid on its face, and it will rebroadcast that transaction to other nodes that are listening on the network. If it does not appear to be valid on its face, then the network simply ignores that transaction. So many transactions being broadcast and rebroadcast on the network. And what we have is on our slide here, an idealized data structure of Bitcoin blocks. What do we mean by that? Well, on the left, we've got our old idealized data structure of a transaction that we had before. In fact, there are 3 of them there: transaction 1, transaction 2, and transaction 3. And then we need the help of Bitcoin miners. These are just users on the network who decided to take on an additional role to help the network achieve distributed consensus, which essentially is an agreement on which transactions to add to the blockchain. What miners will do is they'll actually scoop up several hundred transactions that look to be valid on their face and batch them up in a block. I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit because I'm talking about miners doing this intentional thing of scooping up transactions, etc. Everyone should understand that this is happening behind the scenes through the Bitcoin software by a computer at computer speed. So it's the computer that is looking for transactions. It's the computer that is scooping them up into blocks in order to propose them to be added to the blockchain. So when we look at the data structure on the left-hand side of a block, what we see are the multiple transactions. I've got 3 of them there, but as I said, it's usually several hundred. And you can ignore some of the other parts of that structure that have more to do with the math of Bitcoin. But note that there's also a hash pointer. Unlike our data structure of the transactions on the right side, which is a hash pointer showing the prior transaction where the Bitcoin was transferred, this hash pointer is the hash pointer of the block that points to the immediately prior block on the blockchain to which this block is going to be appended. Those prior blocks represent all of the prior validated batches of transactions going back to the very first transaction on the blockchain, known as the Genesis block. And every time a block is added to the blockchain, it's disseminated to all nodes, and everyone has an updated, then current copy of the blockchain. That is to say, blockchain transactions self-settle in near real time. Not just anyone can propose a batch of transactions to be added as a permanent record of the blockchain. If it were costless to add blocks to the blockchain, then anyone, including malicious actors, could manipulate the blockchain by adding blocks with fraudulent transactions. The Bitcoin blockchain uses a consensus mechanism called proof of work. And proof of work is an arbitrary math puzzle that takes a lot of computational power to solve, which is an outlay in both hardware and energy costs in the real world. Now, the computing power it takes to solve a block is significant. If you were to try to solve a block with an ordinary home computer, hashing and rehashing numbers to solve this math puzzle, it would take about 36,000 years to solve a block. So miners use more high-performing and expensive computers and technology to engage in mining, and they typically do so in consortia with thousands of other miners. There's also the energy consumption that's required to drive these computers at top capacity. Currently, it's estimated that the ecosystem of Bitcoin miners and their use of power exceeds the power consumption of Argentina. So we're talking about very significant uses of energy, which is one of the unfortunate externalities now that we're in Earth Week. It's something that we need to consider. But if a malicious actor tried to propose a block with an altered transaction, it would have to expend real world resources to solve this math puzzle. And then its block would not match the cryptographic hash of the unaltered blockchain that every other node has a copy of. So the malicious actor spends resources and achieves nothing. And this is what's often referred to as the incentive engineering and prevents the Sybil problem. That's one person with lots of alter egos on the network that are really all the same person. The cost of Bitcoin mining with a certain failure of altered transactions making it onto the blockchain makes it highly unprofitable to try and spoof the network. To make the scheme work, one would need to control more than 50% of all of the computing power on the network so that the consensus would be to follow that person's altered blockchain. The Bitcoin blockchain is also parameterized. That is, the block gets solved according to the software that's used about once every 10 minutes on average. At least once a day, 2 blocks get solved at roughly the same time. This creates what's known as a fork in the blockchain. And here we'd be susceptible to the double spend problem that Sue mentioned before. Well, what is that problem? Let's say Alice is going to send 5 Bitcoins to Bob, and she does that in the first transaction. Then she does another transaction close in time and sends those same 5 Bitcoins to Charlie. From the network's perspective, each of those transactions are valid. They just can't both be valid at the same time. So if each transaction is proposed in a different block represented by our gold bees that are parallel to one another on our slide, and they're solved at roughly the same time, those transactions will exist in 2 different blocks on a blockchain fork. Eventually, the blockchain fork will resolve itself and there will be one blockchain again. What happens to the side of the blockchain that gets abandoned is that all of those transactions that are no longer followed because the other side of the fork is being followed simply drop into the melting pot of transactions that will be batched up by miners in future proposed blocks. So once one of Alice's transactions is permanently appended to the blockchain, her other incompatible transaction would be invalid on its face, and it would be ignored. That is, again, it would not be rebroadcast by the other nodes. So the Bitcoin blockchain has a convention. We wait for 6 blocks subsequent to the initial transaction we are interested in to consider our transaction confirmed. It's mathematically infeasible that there would be a 6-block fork on the blockchain. So after 6 subsequent blocks, a transaction is considered confirmed. And since the block is solved once every 10 minutes on average, a transaction is considered confirmed after 1 hour. The use case for using blockchain to pay for blockchain Bitcoins for groceries, for example, is not a good one. Who wants to wait on a grocery line for an hour to have their transaction confirmed? But for other use cases in e-commerce or in trade finance, an hour is a vast improvement over waiting days for payments to clear. But I wanted to return us now to Roger to talk a little bit about stablecoins.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, stablecoins. So we have addressed now the various cryptocurrencies, use cases, also what kind of tokens there are. But many of you may have heard as well of stablecoins. And I think to get a good grip on what stablecoins are, we have to look first to the infrastructure of the token industry on the next slide. So going a bit further on Sam's explanation, if you take a look at the traditional banking system versus the open finance ecosystem, you will see that the public blockchain and the miners can be roughly compared with a central bank issuing money, and the miners do that, for example, with Bitcoin or Ethereum. Then you have in the traditional banking system the commercial banks, where everyone can have an account or take their loans. And those commercial banks can, to some extent, be compared with exchanges that we know, such as Coinbase or Gemini, where you can basically exchange fiat money, so euros, dollars, pounds, yens, into, for example, Bitcoin. Well, if we then take a further step, there is a further open finance infrastructure, which I think goes a bit far for this initial primer. But let's take a look at what happens at the level of the central bank. So the public blockchain miners versus the central bank. And if we go to the next slide, you see that there is increased interest in companies, countries, and banks issuing their own digital token or own cryptocurrency. For example, we saw Facebook that tried to launch the Libra. Yesterday, we had the Britcoin, the British government thinking about issuing their own coins, but also China, the European Union, and also the US is thinking about launching their own stable coins. So what is a stable coin? Well, in the next slide, there's a quick overview on that. A stablecoin is basically a type of cryptocurrency whose value is tied to another outside asset. And that is very good to know. So what happens, for example, is that if you want to start a stablecoin, your intention is not to have a coin that increases in value. You want to have a coin that is basically pegged to something out there in the real world and keeps that value. And the reason why I will explain in a bit, but this is very important to understand. So, for example, you have the USDT, that is called the US dollar tether, that is a stable coin, and everywhere where you go, you will buy this USDT for $1. Sometimes I do have to admit it can be 99 cents or $1 if trading, for example, halts or is very hot, but generally 1 USDT is €1. So that is the easiest case of a stable coin. And these stable coins are basically created to keep people inside the token environment. And what I mean with that is that, for example, if you are a professional trader on an exchange, normally you would, for example, have to exchange every time Bitcoins into physical dollars and hold those dollars on a bank account, wire those dollars back into the exchange when, for example, the market is looking good again, and then trading them already against cryptocurrencies. And this basically creates an atmosphere where you are unable to trade within one environment because you are very dependent on outside organizations like banks. So with stable coins, they allow you to stay on the platform. So for example, a platform like Coinbase will have USDT, a USD Tether, which is the stable coin for the US dollar. They will have a huge amount of those coins on their platform being worth $1. And with that basically digital currency that is always worth $1, people can buy, sell, step in, jump out into Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc., which creates a very fluent way for people to trade. So why are then all the stable coins at this point in time only pegged to one asset? Well, I think a very good reason for that is what we saw a few years back with Facebook Libra. At that time, Libra also wanted to have a stable coin that was so stable because it involved many coins. So a basket of many different coins. I believe it was yen, I believe it was euro, I believe it was Swiss franc and US dollars. They would all combine that to one average price in order to even reduce fluctuation more between those currencies and act some sort as a wildcard bank against that. And while with a single stable coin, it is very possible to only, of course, engage with one central bank. The USDT has got a clearance from a central bank, or at least from the SEC, to have a US dollar pending or pegged to one USDT. However, the problem was that central banks started to object against this stabilized basket and said, well, Libra, we are not likely to allow you to do this. And that basically comes then to the point where, for example, traditional cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are beneficial compared to stablecoins. And that is because a stablecoin, especially one with a basket of different coins, always has one single point of attack. And one single point of attack is, for example, the company or the foundation launching that coin, which can always be directly addressed by a government or a central bank. That is not, of course, as we just heard from Sam, that is not the case with, for example, Bitcoin, because it's so decentralized and it's a software, basically a software machine working on its own. So there is no government that can really impose those kind of controls on one point of attack. So that is the reason why at this point in time we do not see basket stablecoins, but only stablecoins pegged to one kind of existing traditional asset. With these stablecoins, also central banks are coming in, and central banks are saying, listen, what, for example, the Tether Foundation does with US dollars, we can do it ourselves. And we can do it ourselves perhaps even better, because we could launch a euro or a dollar or a British pound on an own government imposed blockchain. And in the next slide, you will see those coins are basically central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. And CBDCs have for governments a very big advantage over the traditional cryptocurrencies, and that is, of course, control. So I took two quotes out by Augustin Cartens, which is the head of the Bank of International Settlements, and Christine Lagarde, who runs the ECB. And if you read both quotes, I think it's pretty obvious why governments would like to have central bank digital currencies, because it's about absolute control, it's about regulation and the technology to enforce that. And of course, one of the big reasons there is to avoid money laundering and also to avoid criminal activity such as terrorism. Having said that, also Christine Lagarde said, I believe 2 or 3 days ago, that she still wants to keep the digital euro, well, a coin where privacy is still allowed. However, it is not anonymous. And that gives me a bit to puzzle, and I think most of you, because I would very much like to see if it is possible to have a coin that would enforce your privacy, but would still not be anonymous. So food for thought. I'm pretty sure we will be hearing a lot of news more on the CBDCs. And like I said, they will have good features because they are government issued. But the other side of the medal is, because they are government issued, these coins also can be printed as long as the government wants. And of course, regulation and control is there where it is perhaps not needed. So food for thought. I'll leave it there, and I will give the word to Susan for the newest novelty in crypto land, NFTs.
Thank you very much, Roger. And yes, so if we move on to the next slide. Yes, indeed, NFTs are very hot property. A digital-only artwork sold at Christie's for an eye-watering £69,346,250. But the winning bidder didn't receive a sculpture, a painting, or even a print. Instead, they got an NFT, a unique digital token. This, I don't know how much you know about this. This piece of work was created by an online digital artist known as Beeple. His real name is Mike Winkleman. He created this image, which is a collage of 5,000 pieces of digital art that he'd prepared previously. And it was the first time, really, it was the first time that Christie's had listed an entirely digital piece of art in its whole 250-year history, and really was seen as the latest milestone in this incredible rise of NFTs. The artist himself was very excited about this. He said, I've been working for at least, artists have been working for the last 20 years on creating digital art using hardware and software, but there was never really a real way to truly own and collect this type of digital art, because digital art is so easily reproducible. And he certainly felt that NFTs are really the beginning of a new chapter in art history, in particular digital art. So he was very exciting that he made such a big influence on the art industry. But if we move on to the next page, what are we really talking about here? What do we mean by NFTs? Well, really, NFTs are one-of-a-kind digital assets that have been created and then tokenized. So you always need the digital thing, which could be an image like Beeple's artwork. It could be a piece of music. It could be a tweet. And then you get a digital certificate of ownership recorded on the blockchain that effectively authenticates your claim of ownership to that asset and allows you to trade it, transfer and sell it like another asset. You can kind of think about it in the same way as we look at, famous paintings like the Mona Lisa. There's lots and lots of copies of the Mona Lisa, probably even on tea towels and on, stationery sets, but there's only one original painting. And so an NFT is really a digital certificate of authenticity, which you use to prove that you own that particular media. Now, the interesting thing here is that instead of, a limited edition print that's been authenticated by the artist, often you're really getting a JPEG file of your particular media. It can look like a meme, it can look like a GIF, but you own that particular one because the blockchain says you do. And the other interesting thing is that ultimately, a lot of people have been just talking about this, the ownership, you don't necessarily have any rights in the underlying media, whether that's a tangible asset or a digital image. And you may not be able to prevent copies. You literally own that particular tokenized item. If you look at, for example, the Twitter example, Jack Dorsey sold an NFT of his first ever tweet for just under $3 million. What does that mean? Well, the buyer can evidence the fact that he owns that tweet. It doesn't mean that that tweet can't be viewed by the whole world, but the whole world can't own it. So it's like having, a unique code, a unique asset that you own. And really the biggest, the driver for it is that it's a scarce resource. And it could be, a great return on investment, like buying Bitcoin at the early days, it went up in value. If somebody buys this Mick Jagger and David Grohl easy sleazy NFT, it's a unique item. It may go up in value over the years. And really the biggest challenge at the moment is whether, and to what extent the bubble bursts. It's a huge phenomenon at the moment. It definitely could be the future of art. But on the other hand, people might make very big investments now. And like with any asset, it could lose value over the years if there is a slump in popularity and there's fewer people who want to buy these things. So if we quickly move on to the next slide, I just wanted to explain again a little bit of context about the NFT market. So who's selling these tokens, these NFTs, and why are they selling them? Well, there's various verticals. It's, as we've seen from Beeple, very popular in the digital art space, but we're also seeing this in gaming and in the collectibles space. And it's really anyone who is looking to generate additional income streams. They want to participate in secondary sales. And particularly for some of these artists and musicians and creators, it's an opportunity to sell directly to their audience and keep more of that revenue if they can, than if they went through sort of more traditional routes. Why would you buy it? And some of you may be scratching your head about why anybody would want to own a tweet. Well, it's unique, rare, or exclusive, particularly if it's, you buying an NFT from the NBA of a particular shot that LeBron James made in an important game. There's some nostalgia around owning that. It's like owning, a baseball card that's been autographed by the player, but it's just a digital format of that. You can buy directly from the creator, which could be, one of your favorite musicians or favorite artists. You can resell the product and you can make some money. And certainly up to now, a lot of the people who are serious collectors of NFTs, it's fair to say, are those people that have a lot of crypto to spend. And they have been speculating with it by buying NFTs, and they're really motivated by the kind of uniqueness and the return on investment. But you then have a whole group of sort of crypto enthusiasts who really like the idea of this, who are motivated by the risk. This is hyped up on all the crypto sort of communications channels, and they love the ideology behind sort of democratizing kind of art and music and gaming in this way. I would say, I'd be really interested if anyone in the audience has bought an NFT, but in the general marketplace, or sort of the general consumer base, it's still fairly low in terms of investment at this time, as far as I'm aware. But that may also change, and maybe this is the death knell of NFTs. I don't know what you would say, but now we have really broken through beyond the sort of crypto space in terms of awareness of NFTs. You have brand names and celebrities now jumping on the chain. So Taco Bell, for example, sold some taco-themed gifts and images. And really the original driver for maybe buyers there was you got a $500 gift card, you know, free with the NFT. But now on the secondary market, those taco cards are being resold. You know, and in those scenarios, there's no gift card. You're just buying it because you like the image of the Taco Bell card, or you think it's going to go up in value, or it's just a bit of fun. And then I was interested to see only a few days ago, Paris Hilton has announced her foray into NFTs, and she is working with digital artists to create her own very own Paris Hilton NFTs, and she thinks this is the future. So, you know, you could say these are signs that this has matured such that maybe the bubble will slightly deflate as it gets a broader interest from individuals and brands and celebrities. On the other hand, it's showing us that it has sort of broken through into more mainstream parts of the economy, and it is an interesting new kind of media and asset class that individuals and brands can create. But kind of going back to one of Sam's points on the Bitcoin explanation, you know, there are various concerns with NFTs. One of the biggest ones is the energy that's used in creating them, because it's reliant on blockchain. And somebody has been monitoring this, and apparently one particular NFT consumed more than one EU resident's entire energy consumption for 2 weeks. So there's a lot of sort of scrutiny now on NFTs and trying to make them as carbon neutral as possible, because that doesn't really align with a lot of these digital creators. You know, they want to be shown to be sustainable. So there's a lot of focus on that. But there's obviously various other legal issues that are interesting that people are starting to think about around, you know, misuse of IP, consumer protection, do people really know what they're buying, and sanctions and AML risks. So thank you very much for attending today. We hope you found it useful. We also encourage you to join us for the next session, where our panel of experts discuss crypto regulation in the EU, Switzerland, the UK, and the USA. To find out more about how we might help you with your crypto projects, please do get in touch with me or with your usual Baker McKenzie contact. We also provide regular updates on crypto assets and blockchain regulation, so please do visit our website and our financial services, technology, and blockchain blogs if you want to keep up to date on crypto news. Thank you.